Maya was on her way home after a long day at work. The sun had set, and the streets were quiet as she drove through her neighborhood, humming along to her favorite song. She didn't notice the police car following her until the flashing red and blue lights lit up her rearview mirror. Confused but calm, she pulled over to the side of the road. A tall, burly officer stepped out of the patrol car. His name tag read Officer Brad. Brad approached her car, his face hard and unwelcoming. "License and registration," he barked. Maya nodded politely and handed over her documents. She had nothing to hide and knew she had done nothing wrong. Brad scanned her papers with a frown, then looked at her as if she had already committed a crime. "These don't look right," he said, though there was nothing actually wrong with them. Maya frowned but stayed calm. "Everything should be in order, officer," she replied, her voice steady. But Brad wasn't interested in logic or fairness. To him, Maya wasn't just another driver. She was someone he could push around. He didn't like her confidence or the quiet strength in her voice. He decided to make things harder for her, simply because he could. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Maya hesitated for a moment, unsure why she was being asked to exit her car. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice still polite, but now tinged with concern. "I said, step out," Brad snapped, louder this time. Not wanting to escalate the situation, Maya complied. As soon as she stepped out, Brad told her she was under arrest for resisting an officer, even though she had done nothing of the sort. Her heart sank, but she didn't resist. She knew that fighting back would only make things worse. At the police station, things only got worse. Brad seemed to enjoy the power he had over her, mocking her and treating her with disrespect. Then, in a cruel act meant to humiliate her, he decided to shave her hair. Maya protested, her voice breaking as she pleaded with him to stop, but Brad didn't care. He smirked as he ignored her cries and shaved her head, leaving her feeling exposed and powerless. What Brad didn't realize, however, was that Maya wasn't someone who would be defeated so easily. And more importantly, he had no idea who her father was, a man who would make sure Brad's actions wouldn't go unanswered. Maya sat silently in the holding cell, running her fingers over her freshly shaved scalp. The humiliation burned deep, but she refused to let it break her. She kept her back straight, her head high, and her eyes steady, even as tears threatened to fall. Maya had always been taught to stay strong in the face of injustice, and right now she clung to those lessons. She knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Far away, in a quiet corner of the city, her father, Charles Johnson, was finishing up his workday. Charles wasn't just any man. He was one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. For years, he had fought against corruption and injustice, winning countless battles for people who couldn't fight for themselves. At that moment, he was unaware of what had happened to his daughter. But that was about to change. Maya's best friend, Simone, had been with her earlier that day and knew something was wrong when Maya didn't come home. After several unanswered calls, Simone began to worry. She reached out to Maya's father, explaining everything she knew. Charles listened carefully, his face darkening with every word. By the time Simone finished, he was already grabbing his coat. "Don't worry," he said firmly. "I'll handle this." Meanwhile, Officer Brad sat in his office, feeling smug about the day's events. To him, Maya was just another name, another face. He didn't care who she was or what she'd been through. Brad believed he was untouchable, protected by the system he worked for. He didn't see Maya as a person, only as someone he could dominate to feed his own sense of power. Back at the station, Charles arrived with fire in his eyes. He didn't storm in or shout. He didn't need to. His presence alone commanded attention. The officers at the front desk immediately recognized him and exchanged nervous glances. Charles was not the kind of man you wanted as an enemy, especially if you had something to hide. After demanding to see his daughter, Charles was led to the holding area. When Maya saw her father, her composure cracked just a little. The strength in his eyes gave her the reassurance she needed. Charles looked at his daughter, taking in her shaved head and tired face. He didn't say much, but his expression said it all. Maya knew one thing for certain. Her father wasn't going to let this go. And Brad. He had no idea what storm was about to hit him. Charles Johnson wasted no time. The moment he left the station with Maya, he was already making calls, pulling in all the resources he could. He had spent his entire career fighting against injustice, but nothing prepared him for the raw anger he felt seeing his daughter treated this way. Maya had always been strong, but seeing her in that holding cell, with her head shaved and her dignity shattered, made him feel something deep inside, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just anger. It was a promise. He would make sure the officer who had done this paid for his actions. Back home, Charles paced the living room as Maya sat quietly, still processing everything that had happened. The house felt too quiet, too still, but Charles wasn't going to let this go. He knew that they needed a plan, and fast. Maya was exhausted, emotionally drained, but she also knew her father would never back down. As much as she appreciated his help, she didn't want to be the one to drag her father back into a battle. But she also knew, with him by her side, they could fight this together. The next day, Charles went straight to work. He began gathering evidence, calling in favors from old contacts, and pulling together a team of investigators who specialized in police misconduct. He was no stranger to fighting powerful forces, but this was different. Officer Brad wasn't just any corrupt cop. He was part of a larger, well-protected system that had been abusing its power for years. Charles knew that the case wouldn't just be about his daughter's humiliation. It would be about exposing a broken system. Meanwhile, Maya, though emotionally drained, started to find a new sense of purpose. She knew that she couldn't stay silent. The thought of other people, especially young women, going through what she had experienced made her stomach turn. She couldn't just walk away and forget. She wanted to speak out, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been wronged by those in power. With her father's encouragement, Maya began meeting with reporters, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. Her calm, dignified presence stood in stark contrast to the injustice she had faced. As her story gained traction, people began to rally behind her. Social media erupted with outrage, and soon local activists were organizing peaceful protests outside the police station, demanding accountability. Brad, on the other hand, was still riding high, oblivious to the storm building around him. He had no idea what was coming. The more people spoke out, the more pressure mounted, and Charles, he was just getting started. He knew that if he played his cards right, not only would Brad face the consequences, but the entire police department's corrupt practices would be exposed for the world to see. This fight was far from over. It had only just begun. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage and growing support for Maya. Her story had struck a chord with people across the country, especially those who had experienced similar injustice. News outlets picked up on her powerful message of resilience, and before long, Maya was being interviewed by reporters from all over. She spoke calmly, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that wasn't going out anytime soon. Maya had never imagined her life would be thrust into the spotlight like this, but now that it was, she knew she had a responsibility. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been mistreated or oppressed by the system. As the media storm continued to grow, she used every platform to call for justice, telling her story over and over again until it couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, Charles was working tirelessly behind the scenes. He had built a reputation over the years as a fearless fighter for civil rights, and now, more than ever, he needed to rely on his experience. He gathered all the evidence he could find, documents, testimonies from witnesses, and even video footage from the night of Maya's arrest. Charles knew this wasn't just about one officer's bad actions. It was about exposing a corrupt system that had allowed officers like Brad to abuse their power unchecked. With each new piece of evidence, Charles's determination grew stronger. He knew that going public with the full details would be a gamble, but he also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. Brad had crossed a line, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. Maya, too, was starting to feel the weight of the situation. Every time she shared her story, she saw the pain in others' eyes, pain that mirrored her own. It was a painful reminder of how much work there was to do, but it also fueled her desire to keep fighting. She found strength in the voices of those who had reached out to her, thanking her for speaking out and sharing their own stories of injustice. For the first time, Maya felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. Then came the moment when Brad realized just how deep the trouble was. He had seen the news reports and read the headlines, but it wasn't until he overheard a conversation in the precinct that he understood the full scope of what he had done. People were talking, and not just about the incident with Maya. They were talking about him. His name was now synonymous with corruption, and his actions had sparked an outcry that couldn't be silenced. Brad's arrogance had kept him from realizing the danger he was in. But as the evidence mounted and the pressure built, he started to panic. He had no idea who Maya's father was or the power that came with that name. Charles Johnson wasn't just any lawyer. He was a force to be reckoned with. Brad's arrogance had blinded him to the fact that he was about to lose everything. As the days passed, the pressure on Officer Brad intensified. Maya's story had sparked a movement, and with every new piece of evidence Charles presented, the case gained more momentum. Brad couldn't escape the growing spotlight on his actions. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous glances and unsteady hands. He realized that the more people talked about his abuse of power, the more he was slipping from the safety of his position. He had never imagined this would happen to him, not in a million years. After all, he was just an officer in a small-town police force. He thought he was untouchable. But he was wrong. Maya, on the other hand, had found a new sense of strength. Her once quiet and reserved nature had transformed into something fierce. She knew the battle was far from over, but with each passing day, she felt more empowered. The support from strangers, her family, and the community filled her with hope, reminding her why she had to keep going. Even though her head was shaved and her body had been treated like an object, her spirit was unbreakable. It was in moments like these that Maya truly understood the power of standing up for what's right. Charles was relentless. He took every call, answered every question, and fought for justice with a determination that could not be shaken. The more he uncovered, the more he realized that Brad wasn't just a rogue officer. He was a part of a larger system that turned a blind eye to corruption. This wasn't a case of one bad apple. It was a culture of abuse that needed to be exposed for what it was. Charles knew that he wasn't just fighting for his daughter anymore. He was fighting to break the chains of systemic injustice that had been holding down so many others for far too long. Then came the day that Brad couldn't avoid the truth any longer. The media had caught wind of the connections Charles had to powerful political figures, and the whispers began to grow louder. As Maya's father made his next move, it became clear that Brad would not be able to outrun the consequences. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about accountability. Brad had made the mistake of underestimating the Johnson family. He had no idea that Maya's father wasn't just an attorney. He was a powerhouse in the fight for civil rights. When Charles made his move, it was swift and unforgiving. Legal papers were filed, complaints were submitted, and before Brad knew it, he was suspended from his position. The department couldn't afford the scandal, and the public outcry only made things worse for him. Brad tried to fight back, but it was too late. The weight of his actions, his arrogance, and his lack of understanding of the people he had wronged came crashing down. Meanwhile, Maya stood tall, her voice unwavering. She knew that justice was on the horizon, and while it wouldn't undo what had been done to her, it would make sure no one else had to go through the same thing. As the days turned into weeks, Brad's world slowly began to crumble. He had underestimated the strength of Maya's family, and now the consequences were impossible to ignore. The public outcry continued to grow, and Brad's name was quickly becoming associated with corruption and abuse. He had been on top of the world, but now it felt as though the ground beneath him was slipping away. No one in his precinct would look at him the same way again, and his once unchallenged position of power had evaporated. Charles Johnson, on the other hand, was making strides in the legal battle. He had gathered enough evidence to show that this was not just a single act of misconduct, it was part of a larger pattern. Brad wasn't an isolated case. His actions were part of a system that had allowed corruption to fester for far too long. Charles had always known that fighting injustice wasn't easy, but now, more than ever, he was determined to see it through. He worked day and night, piecing together every detail, determined to not just expose Brad, but also to bring attention to the systemic issues in the police force. As Charles pushed forward, Maya began to speak out more publicly. She attended rallies, spoke at local community events, and shared her story with anyone who would listen. Maya's strength and resilience inspired countless others to come forward with their own stories of abuse and mistreatment at the hands of those meant to protect them. The more people Maya spoke to, the more she realized the scale of the problem. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all those who had been silenced or ignored. Her voice was powerful, and she was ready to use it. Brad, meanwhile, had hired a team of lawyers to fight back. But no amount of legal defense could shield him from the growing evidence or the public's anger. His once untouchable status in the police force had vanished, and now his future was uncertain. He had been placed on administrative leave, but everyone knew it was just a matter of time before the investigation would lead to his termination and, potentially, criminal charges. As the pressure mounted, Brad began to crack. He had thought that his actions could go unnoticed, but now, it was clear that the system he had once relied on was no longer going to protect him. Charles and Maya's fight had exposed something much bigger than Brad himself, a system of power that was starting to fall apart. On the day that the formal charges were filed against Brad, the news was met with a mixture of triumph and disbelief. Maya stood beside her father, proud of how far they had come. The fight was not yet over, but this victory was a huge step toward justice. Maya's journey was far from finished, but she knew that this moment marked the beginning of real change. The road ahead would be difficult, but with her father's unwavering support and the courage to speak out, she was ready for whatever came next. The day Brad was officially charged was one that Maya would never forget. As she sat in the courtroom with her father by her side, a sense of relief washed over her. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everything they had fought for: the truth, the justice, and the accountability that had been long overdue. The fight had been tough, and at times it felt like the whole world was against them, but they had made it through. They had brought the truth to light, and now there was no turning back. Brad's once confident demeanor was now replaced by a nervous, hollow look as the charges were read out loud. Maya had seen him in his uniform, strong and arrogant, but now the tables had turned. His arrogance had cost him everything, and no lawyer, no excuse could undo the harm he had caused. As the courtroom remained silent, Maya realized that the system, while flawed, was capable of change. For every corrupt officer like Brad, there were people like her father, people who were willing to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. Charles, watching Brad as he stood there, knew that this victory wasn't just a personal one. It was a win for everyone who had ever been mistreated or wronged by those in power. He had worked his entire life to stand up against injustice, and seeing it pay off in such a public way was a testament to everything he believed in. The road to this moment had been long and filled with hardship, but in the end, it had been worth it. He had stood up for his daughter, and in doing so, had inspired so many others to do the same. Outside the courtroom, the scene was chaotic. Reporters swarmed around Maya and Charles, eager for their thoughts on the charges. But as Maya stepped forward, she didn't let the cameras distract her. She had something important to say. She spoke from her heart, about the pain she had endured, but also about the strength she had found in herself and in the support of those around her. Her words resonated with so many people who had been silenced, forgotten, or ignored. Maya knew that her fight was just one part of a much larger movement, a movement that was gaining momentum every day. As the case continued to unfold, the momentum behind it didn't slow down. Brad's suspension became permanent, and soon enough, criminal charges were filed against him. The police department, facing an avalanche of public pressure, began to make changes to their policies. The movement that Maya had started had sparked a ripple effect, and what seemed like an isolated incident had turned into a larger call for reform. Maya and Charles had accomplished what seemed impossible. Brad's abuse of power had been exposed, and the systemic issues within the police force had been brought to the forefront. But for Maya, the fight was far from over. She knew that her journey was just beginning, and that real change would take time. Yet she no longer felt alone in this battle. She had her father, a community of people who supported her, and a new sense of purpose. No matter how difficult the road ahead would be, Maya was ready to face it with courage, determination, and the knowledge that her voice could make a difference.